What happens when a story is so explosive that it outruns its own possibility? Not because it's been proven, not because it's been confirmed, but because it sounds like the kind of thing that would only surface if something truly dark were being hidden. That's how this one began. Quietly at first. Not with a broadcast, not with a podium, not with flags or seals or officials clearing their throats before reading prepared statements. It began the way many modern scandals do. As a declaration already formed, already certain, already stripped of doubt. A claim that didn't ask permission to be questioned. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Somewhere online, someone said that British intelligence had spoken, that the silence had broken, that a line had been crossed, that a press conference had taken place, or maybe a briefing, or maybe something off the record but confirmed. The language shifted depending on who was repeating it, but the authority never did. The names were always the same. MI5, MI6, two institutions whose power, in the public imagination, comes from what they never say. And now, suddenly, according to the story, they had said everything. And at the center of it all was a single name that guaranteed attention before anyone even finished reading the sentence. Meghan Markle. The claim didn't creep. It arrived fully grown, not framed as rumor, not hedged with sources suggest or questions are being raised. It arrived as fact, as exposure, as revelation. And that alone should have slowed people down. But it didn't, because the story wasn't just shocking. It was designed to be believed. Think about it for a moment. When people hear intelligence agencies, they don't picture press releases. They picture secrets, dark rooms, files stamped with warnings. People who know things the rest of us aren't allowed to know. So when a claim says, they spoke, but you didn't see it, the absence becomes part of the evidence. No video? Of course not. No transcript? Classified. No official confirmation? That's what they want. And just like that, the lack of proof stops being a problem. It becomes the point. This is where the story stops being about a single allegation and starts being about something much larger. Something more uncomfortable. Something that should make all of us pause, regardless of where we stand, or who we trust, or who we distrust. Because this wasn't just about what was being claimed. It was about how it was being claimed, and why so many people didn't ask whether it could even happen. Let's slow this down. British intelligence agencies do not hold press conferences, not in the way the internet imagines them. Their work is governed by law, oversight committees, parliamentary review, and layers of institutional restraint that exist precisely to prevent the kind of spectacle this story describes. When they speak publicly, which is rare, it is cautious, narrow, procedural, almost dull. And yet, the version of events that spread online was cinematic, emotional, moral, clear-cut, villains and victims already assigned. That's not an accident. Because stories that thrive online today aren't built around verification. They're built around resolution, around emotional closure, around the promise that chaos will finally make sense if you just keep watching, keep reading, keep sharing. This one promised something even more intoxicating. It promised authority, not journalists, not courts, not historians, but the highest, darkest rung of institutional power stepping in to settle the matter once and for all. Ask yourself honestly. When you first heard the claim, did you want it to be true? That question matters more than it seems. Because belief, in cases like this, doesn't begin with evidence. It begins with appetite, with frustration, with years of accumulated resentment, suspicion, fatigue, with a sense, fair or not, that powerful people never face consequences unless something even more powerful intervenes. An intelligence agency is the ultimate intervention fantasy, but fantasies come with a cost. The moment we accept that unnamed officials held unnamed briefings at unnamed locations and revealed unnamed evidence that no one can produce, we've crossed a line. Not politically, not ideologically, epistemologically. We've decided that certainty feels better than truth. And that decision doesn't stay contained. It spreads. Because once one story like this is believed, the next one doesn't need to be better. It just needs to be louder, more detailed, more disturbing, more emotionally specific. Which is exactly what happened next. Details began to appear that hadn't existed before. Visual elements, physical descriptions, objects, props, claims so precise they felt impossible to invent. The kind of specificity that triggers a dangerous instinct in the human brain. No one would make that up. But people do. All the time. Especially when the reward structure encourages it. This is where we need to be careful. Not cautious in the sense of timid. Careful in the sense of precise. Because there is a difference between saying, "This did not happen," and saying, "There is no verifiable evidence that this happened," and the structure of the claim contradicts how reality works. That difference is the line between investigation and accusation. And we're going to stay on the right side of it. What matters here is not defending anyone. It's understanding the machinery that turned an unverified claim into a viral certainty. The way silence was reframed as confirmation. The way institutional secrecy was weaponized as proof. The way emotional satisfaction replaced critical friction. This matters right now because this isn't an isolated incident. The same architecture shows up again and again. Different names, different targets, same blueprint, anonymous authority, uncheckable claims, escalating details, outrage as propulsion, and audiences pulled along not because they're foolish, but because they're human. We don't live in an information age anymore. We live in a conviction age, where stories don't compete on accuracy, they compete on how decisively they tell you what to think. And this one told people exactly what they wanted to hear. So before we go any further, let's be clear about what we're doing here. We are not here to repeat the claim. We are not here to sanitize it. And we are certainly not here to pretend it doesn't exist. We're here to take it apart. Slowly, methodically, without rushing to the comfort of easy conclusions. We're going to trace where it came from, how it changed as it spread, why certain phrases were chosen, why certain institutions were named, why the story hardened instead of softening when questions were asked. And perhaps most importantly, we're going to examine what it says about us, as audiences, as sharers, as participants in an ecosystem that rewards belief over verification. Because if this story can take hold without evidence, then the next one won't even need plausibility. And somewhere in the middle of all that, buried beneath certainty, outrage, and repetition, is a far more unsettling question. If the most powerful authority in a story exists only because no one can check it, what does that mean for the stories we'll believe next? And once you see how this one was built, you won't be able to unsee what comes after. Most scandals leak. They use out in fragments. A document here, a quote there. A source who won't go on the record but hints just enough to keep journalists circling. Real controversies arrive imperfectly, uneven, awkward, full of gaps. This one didn't. This one appeared online like a finished product. Not a question, not a hypothesis, not even a rumor in the traditional sense. It arrived already resolved, already judged, already narrated with a beginning, a middle, and an implied end. And that should have been the first warning sign. Because when something emerges without a trail, without the fingerprints of uncertainty, it usually means the uncertainty was edited out. Let's rewind to the moment this story entered circulation. There was no single original post. No patient zero you can easily point to. Instead, there were clusters. Identical phrasing appearing across different platforms within a short window. The same sentences, sometimes word for word, sometimes lightly rearranged. The same authoritative tone. The same claim of access. The same implication. British intelligence had spoken, and the public had somehow missed it. MI5, MI6. The names were dropped without explanation, as if no explanation were needed. As if invoking them alone settled the matter. What's striking, when you examine those early posts closely, is what they don't contain. No dates. No locations. No names of officials. No explanation of why such a disclosure would happen at all. And yet, the confidence was absolute. That's not how people talk when they're uncertain. It's how people talk when they want you to stop thinking. One version claimed a press conference. Another quietly downgraded it to a briefing. Another said it was off camera, or not meant for public release, or confirmed privately to senior media figures. Each adjustment solved a problem raised by skeptics. Each revision made the claim more slippery, not more solid. That adaptability is important. Because it tells us this story wasn't discovered. It was maintained. Here's something journalists learn early. When a story is real, details resist manipulation. You can't move the date without breaking something. You can't change the setting without creating contradictions. Reality has edges. Fabricated narratives don't. They flex. And this one flexed constantly. When people asked why no British outlet had reported such a momentous event, the answer was secrecy. When they asked why Parliament hadn't acknowledged it, the answer was compartmentalization. When they asked why intelligence agencies would even comment on a private family matter, the answer was always the same vague gesture toward national security. National security has become the ultimate conversational dead end. Once invoked, no further questions are expected or allowed. But think about the inversion happening here. Intelligence agencies are defined by restraint, by limits, by the careful avoidance of public spectacle. Their credibility depends on not doing exactly what this story claims they did. And yet, that contradiction didn't weaken the narrative. It strengthened it. Because the claim wasn't designed to align with how institutions operate. It was designed to align with how people imagine institutions operate. That distinction matters. The earliest versions of the story didn't go viral because they were detailed. They went viral because they were decisive. They offered moral clarity in a space that had become exhausting and ambiguous. Years of coverage, endless debate, conflicting interpretations, fatigue, suspicion, then suddenly, finality. The intelligence agencies have spoken. Case closed. Ask yourself, when you first encountered the claim, did you feel relief? Relief is a powerful accelerant. It doesn't ask for evidence. It asks for release. And release is exactly what this story provided. But relief has a side effect. It dulls curiosity. Instead of asking, is this true? Many people jump straight to, why wasn't this reported sooner? Or, why is the media covering this up? Those are downstream questions. They assume the premise. That's how a narrative locks in. Once the premise is accepted, skepticism becomes betrayal. Doubt becomes complicity. And anyone who asks for verification is accused not of being careful, but of being biased. This is the psychological pivot point where stories stop behaving like information and start behaving like identity markers. And it happened quickly. Within days, the language hardened. What began as reports suggest turned into confirmed. What began as allegedly vanished entirely. New creators entered the space not to question the claim, but to build on it. To add layers. To supply the details that were missing. That's when specificity entered the picture. Specificity is dangerous when it's untethered from sourcing. It gives the illusion of proximity, of access, of having seen something with your own eyes. But if you track the timeline carefully, those specific details don't appear at the beginning. They appear later, after the story has already spread, after belief has already taken root. That sequence matters. In real investigations, details lead the story. Here, the story led the details. Which raises a question we're going to keep coming back to. If this were true, why didn't it surface the way truths usually do? Why didn't it leak to a single reputable journalist? Why didn't it fracture into competing accounts? Why didn't it provoke denials, parliamentary questions, legal filings, anything that would leave a trace? Instead, it floated. Perfectly. Unchallenged except by people dismissed as naive or malicious for asking how any of this could be verified. And notice something else. The claim never asked you to examine evidence. It asked you to examine motives. Of course they'd hide it. Of course the media wouldn't report it. Of course the truth would be buried. That's not evidence-based reasoning. It's narrative reasoning. It builds a self-sealing logic where every absence confirms the story instead of weakening it. This is where we need to slow down again. Because the danger here isn't just one false claim. It's the template. A claim that appears fully formed. An authority that cannot be questioned. A silence reframed as confirmation. A moral conclusion delivered before the facts. Once you recognize that template, you start seeing it everywhere. And the more emotionally charged the subject, the faster the template works. Which brings us to the name at the center of this. Meghan Markle. Whether people support her, oppose her, or feel exhausted by the entire conversation, her presence in the narrative is not incidental. She is a lightning rod. A symbol. A proxy for arguments that have very little to do with her as an individual and everything to do with power, resentment, class, race, media trust, and cultural fracture. That makes her an ideal target for a story like this. Not because it's true, but because it's believable to those already primed to distrust her. This is uncomfortable to say, but it's necessary. Stories don't spread evenly. They spread where the ground is already fertile. And by the time skeptics began asking basic questions, Where is the evidence? Who said this? Why would intelligence agencies intervene here? The ground had already been planted, watered, and harvested. The story didn't need to convince anyone anymore. It just needed to be repeated. And repetition does something insidious. It turns familiarity into credibility. You see the same claim enough times, from different voices, on different platforms, and your brain starts to register it not as information, but as background noise, as something that everyone knows. That's when myths graduate into assumed reality. So the question isn't just, is this claim true? The more urgent question is, how did it become unnecessary for so many people to even ask? Because once that threshold is crossed, evidence becomes optional. Authority becomes decorative. And the loudest voice wins by default. And just when the narrative seemed settled, when belief had hardened into certainty, something else happened. The story didn't stabilize. It escalated. New elements appeared that hadn't been mentioned before. Visual descriptions, objects, specific actions, details so provocative they forced a reaction even from people who had tried to ignore the entire thing. That escalation wasn't random. It followed a pattern. And the next chapter is where that pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because the moment specificity enters a story without sourcing, you're no longer watching information spread. You're watching fiction being engineered in real time. There's a reason this story didn't claim a journalist broke it, or a whistleblower, or a court filing, or a leaked document. Those would have required proof. Instead, it claimed something far more powerful and far more untouchable. British intelligence, MI5, MI6, two names that don't just suggest knowledge. They suggest omniscience, reach, finality. When people invoke them, they're not asking you to verify. They're asking you to surrender. Because how do you argue with an institution whose defining feature is that you'll never see what it knows? That's the psychological shortcut at the heart of this chapter. And once you see it, it becomes impossible to ignore. Let's be honest with ourselves for a moment. Most people don't actually know what MI5 or MI6 do. They know the mythology, the shadows, the films, the idea that somewhere, behind locked doors, someone is watching everything, recording everything, waiting. That mythology is powerful, and it's wildly inaccurate. But accuracy was never the goal here. Authority was. When the claim named intelligence agencies, it did two things at once. First, it elevated itself above ordinary scrutiny. Second, it insulated itself from contradiction. Because journalists can be challenged, courts can be appealed, documents can be forged or authenticated. But intelligence agencies? Their silence is baked in. Their absence is expected. And that makes them the perfect fictional witness. Think about the rhetorical move being made. The story doesn't say, "Here is the evidence." It says, "The people who have all the evidence have already seen it." That's not a claim. It's a demand for trust. And trust, once granted, is very difficult to revoke. This is where the story becomes less about the subject at its center and more about the machinery around it. The choice to invoke intelligence agencies wasn't accidental. It was strategic. Because intelligence agencies carry three assumptions in the public mind. 1. They know more than anyone else. 2. They don't speak unless something is serious. 3. If they're silent, it's because they're hiding something. All three are false in practice, but devastatingly effective in narrative. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you wanted to invent an authority that could never be checked, never be quoted directly, never be confronted, and never be disproven, you couldn't design a better one. Intelligence agencies are not just secretive. They are structurally unresponsive. They don't correct rumors. They don't issue denials about private individuals. They don't hold press conferences to settle internet disputes. And that's exactly why they were chosen. Because their real-world behavior creates the illusion of credibility when misused. Notice how the claim evolved whenever people pushed back. When someone asked, "Why would MI5 comment on this?" the answer wasn't evidence. It was implication. National security, state interests, threats too sensitive to explain. When someone asked, "Why would MI6 be involved in a domestic matter?" the answer shifted again. Cross-border concerns, international optics, foreign actors. Each explanation didn't clarify anything. It widened the fog. That's not accidental. Vagueness is a feature, not a flaw. The more vague the justification, the harder it is to falsify. And once you're inside that fog, Reason starts to feel naive. Skepticism feels unsophisticated. Asking for proof sounds almost childish, as if you failed to understand how the world really works. That's the emotional manipulation at play here. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It sighs. It smirks. It implies that if you don't believe this, you simply don't understand power. But let's ground ourselves again. Intelligence agencies do not exist to validate online narratives. Their mandate is narrowly defined. Their oversight is real. Their disclosures, when they happen at all, are controlled, legalistic, and boring by design. They don't confirm sensational claims about private individuals. They don't stage revelations for public consumption. They don't act as moral arbiters in cultural wars. And crucially, they don't leak in unison. If there had been any genuine intelligence concern related to this story, you would not see it emerge as a perfectly synchronized narrative across fringe platforms. You would see fractures, conflicting interpretations, competing leaks, journalists arguing over what it meant. Reality is messy. This story wasn't. It was clean. Too clean. Which raises another important question. Why not invent a document? Why not claim a file number, a memo, a report? Because documents can be analyzed. Authority without artifacts can't. By invoking intelligence agencies without producing anything tangible, the story positioned itself beyond verification and beyond refutation. It created a closed loop. If you believe it, the agency's silence confirms it. If you doubt it, the agency's silence proves how deep it goes. That's not investigative logic. That's conspiracy logic. And conspiracy logic doesn't require proof. It requires participation. You're either in or you're suspect. This is why stories like this are so effective and so dangerous. They don't ask you to evaluate facts. They ask you to declare allegiance. And once people declare allegiance, they stop listening. There's another layer here that often goes unnoticed. Invoking intelligence agencies doesn't just add authority. It adds fear. Not overt fear. Subtle fear. The suggestion that there are consequences for knowing too much. For speaking out. For asking the wrong questions. It creates an atmosphere where silence feels prudent and belief feels safe. But safe from what? That question never gets answered. It doesn't need to. Fear without an object is one of the most powerful motivators there is. And it keeps people from stepping back and asking the most basic question of all. Is this even plausible? Because plausibility matters. Intelligence agencies operate under strict legal frameworks. They do not act independently of government oversight. They cannot simply decide to expose private family matters without triggering institutional shockwaves. If something like this had occurred, it would not exist solely as an internet rumor. It would leave marks. Parliamentary murmurs. Legal filings. Media inquiries. Something. Instead, we have a story that floats above the system it claims to involve. That's not how power works. That's how stories about power work. And the distinction matters more than ever. Because once intelligence agencies become narrative props, once their mystique is hijacked to lend weight to unverified claims, we enter dangerous territory. Not because of this story alone, but because the next one will go further. If MI5 and MI6 can be casually inserted into an unverified claim and accepted by thousands, what happens when the target isn't a public figure? When it's a private individual? When it's you? Authority, once detached from accountability, becomes a weapon. And this story showed just how easy it is to do that. Which brings us to the next turn. Because once the authority was established, once intelligence agencies had been successfully positioned as silent witnesses, the story no longer needed plausibility. It needed imagery. Something visceral. Something concrete. Something that could bypass rational filters and go straight for the gut. That's when the narrative shifted. Away from institutions. Toward objects. And the next chapter is where the story stopped pretending to be informational and revealed its true engine. Because that's where the doll appeared. And nothing accelerated belief faster than that. Here's where the story should have collapsed under its own weight. Because the phrase at the heart of it, the one repeated most confidently, is also the one that makes the least sense. A secret press conference. Read that again. Slowly. Press conferences, by definition, are not secret. They exist to put something on the record, to create a public trace, to establish accountability, to ensure that what is said can be quoted, challenged, contextualized. Secrecy and press conferences are opposites. And yet, This contradiction didn't repel belief. It attracted it. That's the paradox we need to sit with for a moment. When people repeated the claim, they didn't stumble over the language. They didn't pause to ask how something could be both hidden and publicly briefed. They absorbed the contradiction and moved on, as if the logic didn't matter anymore. Why? Because the story wasn't asking to be understood. It was asking to be felt. Early versions were blunt. MI5 held a press conference. Full stop. When skeptics pointed out the impossibility, the language shifted just enough to survive. It became a closed-door briefing, then a background session, then an off-record intelligence disclosure. Each iteration solved a problem raised by doubt. But notice what never changed. The conclusion. The conclusion always stayed intact, untouched by the adjustments that preceded it. The process bent to protect the outcome, not the other way around. That's a tell. In real reporting, conclusions emerge reluctantly, often provisionally, and are revised as new facts arrive. In manufactured narratives, conclusions come first, and everything else is engineered to support them. The idea of a secret press conference did something else, too. It created an imagined audience. Not the public, not voters, not citizens, but an elite group, journalists, insiders, officials, who supposedly heard the truth and then chose not to tell anyone else. That implication is powerful. It flatters the believer. It suggests that you're not just informed. You're perceptive enough to see through the cover-up, and it redirects anger. Instead of asking, "Is this claim true?" people start asking, "Why are they hiding this from us?" The target shifts from the story to the system. That's how myths protect themselves. If you believe a secret briefing happened, then every institution that doesn't acknowledge it becomes complicit. Media silence stops being evidence against the claim and becomes evidence of suppression. That's a self-sealing loop. Let's ground this again. In the UK, any meaningful public action by intelligence agencies, especially anything that would intersect with public trust, media responsibility, or reputational harm, would trigger oversight mechanisms. Not later. Immediately. Committees, parliamentary inquiries, legal constraints, whispers, at the very least, within the ecosystem that covers governance. You would not see universal silence. Even the most tightly controlled disclosures leave ripples. Human beings talk. Journalists compare notes. Editors argue. Rival outlets try to outflank each other. None of that happened. Instead, we saw something else entirely. A story that lived exclusively online, repeating itself in circles, growing more confident with each retelling, unchallenged by the systems it claimed to involve. That's not secrecy. That's insulation. And the insulation came from language. Words like briefing, sources, intelligence, off-record. They sound procedural, bureaucratic, legitimate. But when they're untethered from specifics, they become costumes. This is where the imagination fills in the gaps. People picture rooms, long tables, men and women in dark suits, files sliding across polished surfaces. A moment where something unthinkable is finally acknowledged. That mental image does a lot of work. It replaces the need for verification. It creates a scene vivid enough to feel real. And once a scene feels real, people stop asking whether it exists. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. When you heard press conference, did you picture microphones and cameras? Or did you picture something clandestine, hushed, restricted? If it's the latter, then the story has already done its job, because it has detached the phrase from its meaning and reattached it to emotion. There's another reason this particular phrase survived scrutiny. It suggests consensus. A press conference implies multiple parties present, multiple witnesses, multiple confirmations. It implies that whatever was said wasn't the opinion of one rogue actor, but an institutional position. That's critical, because individual sources can be doubted. Institutions, in the public imagination, feel sturdier. But here's the catch. Institutions do not communicate through implication. They communicate through record. If something cannot be cited, quoted, dated, or contextualized, it doesn't exist in the institutional sense. It exists only as rumor. And this story tried to smuggle rumor into the category of record without leaving a trace. That's not how history is made. It's how legends are. At some point, the claim became so malleable that its defenders stopped trying to describe what actually happened and focused instead on why you couldn't see it. That's when the burden of proof inverted. Instead of the claimant having to show evidence, the skeptic was asked to explain why there was none. Why haven't you seen it? Why haven't you heard it? Why would they tell you? Those questions feel incisive. They're not. They're evasive. They shift the conversation away from plausibility and toward suspicion. And suspicion is much easier to maintain than proof. There's a broader cultural current here we need to acknowledge. We live in an era where public trust in institutions has eroded, but belief in institutional power has not. People doubt the media, doubt governments, doubt courts. But they still believe that somewhere, someone knows the truth and is choosing not to share it. That gap between distrust and belief is where stories like this thrive. They exploit cynicism without challenging authority. They tell you the system is corrupt, but only at the level you can't see. And that's comforting, in a way, because it means the world is still ordered, still controlled, still legible, if only you could access the right room. The myth of the secret press conference taps directly into that desire. It says, the truth exists. It has been spoken. You just weren't invited. And once that idea takes hold, evidence becomes irrelevant. All that matters is exclusion. But exclusion from what? No one can say. Because there was no room, no table, no microphones, no record, only repetition, only confidence, only the steady erosion of doubt through familiarity. By the time critics pointed out that the phrase itself was incoherent, the story had moved on. It no longer needed to defend the logistics. It had found something far more effective. A symbol. Something concrete enough to replace the abstract authority of institutions. Something visual. Something visceral. Something that bypassed logic entirely. That's when the narrative shifted from rooms and briefings to objects and imagery. From process to spectacle. And that shift is where belief stopped being intellectual and became emotional. Because the next element didn't ask you to think. It asked you to react. And once that happened, the story no longer needed to make sense. It just needed to make you feel something. That's where we're going next. Because the moment the imagery appeared, the story crossed a line it could never uncross. And it did so deliberately. This is the moment everything changed. Up until now, the story had lived in abstractions. Institutions, briefings, secrecy, authority. You could argue with it. You could poke at the logic. You could still, if you wanted to, keep a little distance. And then the imagery arrived. Not gently, not tentatively, but with a confidence that suggested it had always been there, waiting to be noticed. A doll. That single word did more work than any mention of intelligence agencies ever could. Because the moment the narrative introduced a physical object, something you could picture, something you could recoil from, the conversation stopped being about plausibility and started being about shock. This is where many people remember encountering the story for the first time. Not in its early, procedural phase, but here, at the point where the claim crossed from something happened into something grotesque happened. And that's not accidental. Let's be precise about the sequence. The earliest versions of the story did not mention any object. No props, no visuals, no tactile detail. They relied entirely on implied authority. That was enough to seed belief, but not enough to make it viral. Virality requires friction. It requires something that interrupts the scroll, something that produces an involuntary reaction before the brain has time to evaluate. A doll does that. It's uncanny. It's unsettling. It carries cultural baggage. It evokes deception, artificiality, substitution. And crucially, it feels specific. Specificity is persuasive. When people hear a claim like this, they don't ask, "Is this likely?" They ask, "Who would think to invent something so particular?" That question is a trap. Because the answer is simple. People invent specific details all the time, especially when they're trying to escalate a story that's beginning to stall. Here's what happens in online narrative ecosystems. A claim emerges. It spreads. It reaches saturation. Engagement plateaus. Audiences become desensitized. The story needs a new hook to keep moving. So it mutates. The mutation doesn't come from evidence. It comes from imagination. And imagination, under pressure, tends toward the extreme. The doll narrative did exactly what it was supposed to do. It broke through fatigue. It forced reaction. It created a line that people felt compelled to cross, either to condemn or to defend, but not to ignore. Notice how quickly the tone shifted once this element appeared. Before, people debated institutions. After, they debated morality. Before, skepticism was possible. After, skepticism felt cold, even cruel. Because now, doubting the claim wasn't just about doubting a story. It was about doubting a disturbing image. And questioning disturbing images feels wrong to many people, even when they're unverified. That's a powerful psychological lever. But we need to ask the question that almost no one stopped to ask at the time. Where did this detail come from? Not who repeated it, not who amplified it, but where it actually originated. When you trace it back, and this takes time, because the story was already spreading fast by then, you don't find a document. You don't find a source. You don't find a whistleblower. You find speculation layered on speculation. Forum posts, comment sections, reaction videos responding to other reaction videos. Each iteration slightly more vivid than the last. Each retelling adding texture, not verification. And here's the critical point. The doll detail does not appear at the beginning of the story. It appears after belief has already taken hold. That matters. Because if this were a real revelation, you would expect the most shocking element to surface first, not last. It would be the core, not an add-on. It would drive the story, not rescue it. Instead, it behaves like a narrative accelerant. Something introduced precisely when attention risked drifting. And once it's introduced, it's impossible to remove. Because now the story has an image. And images stick. Ask yourself something honestly. When you think about this claim now, what do you picture? Do you picture documents, briefings, institutional processes? Or do you picture the object? If it's the latter, then the story has already reprogrammed how it's remembered. That's the danger of visual specificity without sourcing. It hijacks memory. But there's another layer here that makes this even more troubling. The doll narrative isn't just specific. It's symbolic. It suggests substitution, fakery, performance. It taps into a pre-existing cultural suspicion around authenticity, motherhood, and public image. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It plugs into narratives that were already circulating, already emotionally charged, which makes it feel, to some audiences, not just shocking, but confirming, as if it explains everything they already believed but couldn't quite articulate. That's how false details become obvious truths. They don't convince. They resonate. And resonance is far more dangerous than persuasion. Because resonance doesn't ask for proof. It asks for recognition. There's also a darker reason this particular image spreads so effectively. It dehumanizes. Once a story introduces an object in place of a person, the person themselves becomes abstract, reduced, easier to accuse, easier to punish, easier to strip of complexity. This is a pattern we see again and again in misinformation narratives. Objects become stand-ins for intent. Symbols replace evidence. And once that happens, the story no longer needs to explain how or why anything occurred. It only needs to repeat the symbol. The doll became shorthand. Creators didn't need to explain the claim anymore. They could just allude to it, reference it, show an image, let the audience fill in the rest. That's when the story truly escaped control. Because now, even people who hadn't followed the earlier phases could grasp the supposed horror instantly. No context required, just reaction. This is where restraint disappeared entirely. The language hardened. The certainty intensified. The story stopped evolving and started calcifying. New details weren't questioned. They were welcomed. Because at this stage, the narrative wasn't being evaluated. It was being defended. And anyone who raised doubts about the origin of this detail was accused of minimizing something too serious to question. That's an inversion worth sitting with. The more serious a claim is, the more rigor it demands. But here, seriousness was used as a shield against scrutiny. There is no verifiable source for this detail. No record. No testimony. No document. No corroboration. Just repetition. And repetition, as we've already seen, is powerful enough to manufacture memory. This is the moment where the story crossed from rumor into something more corrosive. Because now it wasn't just alleging misconduct. It was telling people what to imagine. And once people imagine something vivid enough, it doesn't matter whether it's real. It feels real. Which brings us to a hard truth. The doll narrative didn't spread because it was credible. It spread because it was effective. Effective at capturing attention. Effective at provoking disgust. Effective at shutting down nuance. And effectiveness, in the attention economy, is often mistaken for truth. But there's something else we need to examine before moving on. Because this wasn't just about one shocking detail. It was about how platforms rewarded the escalation. The moment this imagery appeared, engagement spiked. Views climbed. Shares multiplied. Algorithms took notice. And creators learned a lesson, consciously or not. Go further. Be more specific. Be more disturbing. Be more definitive. That feedback loop didn't just amplify the story. It reshaped it. And once that loop is active, the original claim becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is what keeps people watching. Which means the story was no longer being driven by belief alone. It was being driven by incentives. And that's where things get even more complicated. Because when attention becomes currency, truth becomes optional. Because once the algorithm gets involved, escalation isn't just likely. It's inevitable. There's a moment in every viral story when human intention stops mattering as much as machine response. Up to that point, people are still driving the narrative. Choosing words. Selecting angles. Deciding what to emphasize and what to leave out. But once engagement crosses a certain threshold, something else takes over. Something indifferent to truth. Something that doesn't care what's plausible, or humane, or even coherent. The algorithm. And this is where the story we've been tracking stopped being merely repeated and started being optimized. Not optimized for accuracy. Optimized for reaction. Shorter clips began to circulate. Cropped screenshots. Red arrows. Emphatic captions. The same phrases reappearing, stripped of context, sharpened for speed. Each iteration a little louder. A little more certain. A little more disturbing. Because the systems that govern visibility don't reward caution. They reward interruption. Think about how you actually encounter stories online. You're not sitting down to read a report. You're scrolling. Half attentive. Distracted. Moving fast. Anything that slows you down has already won a small victory. Outrage slows you down. Shock slows you down. Disgust slows you down. Nuance does not. And once creators realize that, whether consciously or not, the incentives change. This is where platforms like YouTube and TikTok become part of the story, not as villains, but as environments. They don't invent claims. They amplify what keeps people engaged the longest. That's their job. The problem is that engaged doesn't mean informed. It means watching, commenting, arguing, sharing, rewatching. Disturbing content excels at all of those. Once the doll imagery entered the narrative, the metrics spiked. You can see it in view counts, in comment velocity, in how quickly similar videos were recommended alongside one another. The system learned something simple and brutal. This version performs better, so it got shown more. And when something gets shown more, it doesn't just reach new audiences. It reshapes the behavior of the people creating it. Creators watch their analytics. They notice which videos take off, which thumbnails get clicked, which phrases trigger comments, which moments get clipped and reposted by others. They adapt, not because they're malicious, necessarily, but because the system teaches them what works. That's how escalation happens without a single conscious decision to lie. One creator frames the claim with a little more certainty. Engagement rises. Another adds a more vivid description. Engagement rises again. A third presents the story as already settled, as if disagreement is absurd. Engagement explodes. The algorithm doesn't see falsehood. It sees velocity. And velocity is contagious. There's a concept in media studies that's useful here: extremity bias. Content that occupies the far ends of an emotional spectrum travels faster than content in the middle. Calm skepticism is invisible. Careful analysis is forgettable. But outrage and horror cut through the noise. So the story didn't just grow. It skewed. Each retelling drifted further from conditional language. Allegedly disappeared. Questions turned into statements. Doubts became attacks. The most disturbing version of the claim began to crowd out all others. Not because it was truer, but because it was louder. And here's the part that's uncomfortable to acknowledge. Audiences participated in this. Not because they wanted to spread misinformation, but because they were reacting emotionally. Commenting. Sharing with disbelief or anger. Sending links to friends with "Have you seen this?" attached. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between outrage and endorsement. Engagement is engagement, which means every reaction, even critical ones, helped push the most extreme versions further into circulation. This is how stories become inescapable. Once the system decides something is sticky, it surrounds you with it. Related videos, suggested posts, recommended accounts. The same claim refracted through different voices, giving the illusion of independent confirmation. You see it everywhere, so it must be real. That's the cognitive shortcut the brain takes under repetition. And repetition was relentless. But notice what didn't happen during this escalation. No new evidence emerged. No documents surfaced. No sources came forward. The story grew in intensity, not in substance. That's another tell. In legitimate investigations, escalation is driven by discovery. New facts force reevaluation. New information complicates the narrative. Things become messier, not cleaner. Here, escalation made the story simpler. More absolute. More binary. Believe or deny. Us or them. Truth or cover up. That simplification is algorithmically advantageous. Complex stories require patience. Simple moral binaries invite participation. Comment sections filled with certainty, not curiosity. Declarations, not questions. Anyone expressing doubt was accused of defending the indefensible, of being naive, of being compromised. This social pressure matters because people don't just consume stories online. They perform their reactions publicly. And once a dominant emotional tone is established, deviating from it feels risky. No one wants to be the person saying, "Slow down," when everyone else is shouting, "Finally." So silence increases. Skeptics withdraw. The loudest voices dominate. And the algorithm, again, learns a lesson. This is what people want. But here's the deeper problem. Algorithms don't just amplify content. They shape memory. When the most extreme version of a story is what people encounter first, it becomes the baseline. Later corrections, caveats, or contextual explanations feel like walkbacks or excuses. Once you've seen the shocking version, the restrained version feels dishonest, even if it's accurate. That's why debunking often fails. It's not that people can't understand corrections. It's that corrections arrive too late, in the wrong emotional register, and without the algorithmic momentum of the original claim. And the creators know this. Some lean into it. Some rationalize it. Some tell themselves they're just asking questions, even as their thumbnails and titles scream conclusions. The system rewards those who go furthest, fastest. And this is where the story became almost impossible to contain. Because now, anyone entering the conversation for the first time wasn't encountering a claim. They were encountering a consensus. Dozens of videos, hundreds of comments, thousands of shares, all reinforcing the same narrative, the same imagery, the same certainty. It doesn't feel like rumor at that scale. It feels like reality. That's the power of algorithmic amplification. It doesn't persuade through argument. It persuades through saturation. And once saturation sets in, reintroducing doubt feels like heresy. But there's another layer we need to examine. Because while algorithms amplify, they also distort. They favor brevity, compression, simplification. Nuance gets shaved off with each repost. Context disappears. Original disclaimers vanish. What remains is the most emotionally potent fragment. The story you see at the end of that process is rarely the story that began it. It's a caricature, a sharpened silhouette, a version designed not to inform, but to provoke. And the more it provokes, the more it spreads. This creates a feedback loop that's very difficult to interrupt. Creators chase engagement. Algorithms reward extremity. Audiences react emotionally. Skepticism retreats. Round and round it goes. At no point does truth enter the equation. That's not cynicism. That's mechanics. And this is why focusing on individual bad actors misses the point. You can remove one video, one account, one post. The system will simply surface another because the demand still exists. The story has become a product. And products don't disappear because they're inaccurate. They disappear when they stop performing. Which raises a disturbing question. If a story's survival depends on being as shocking as possible, what incentive is there to correct it? Especially when correction is boring. Especially when correction feels anticlimactic. Especially when correction threatens the very engagement that made the creator visible in the first place. This is the quiet corruption at the heart of the attention economy. It doesn't require malice. It requires metrics. And the metrics favored the most disturbing version of this story every time. But there's something else the algorithm did that we haven't talked about yet. It didn't just amplify the claim. It sorted audiences. People who watched these videos were shown more of the same. Gradually, incrementally, each recommendation nudging them deeper into a single interpretive frame. That's how echo chambers form without anyone choosing them. You don't decide to enter one. You slide into it. And inside an echo chamber, repetition feels like confirmation. Dissent feels rare. Doubt feels suspicious. By the time someone encounters a contradictory perspective, it feels like an intrusion, not an alternative. This is how belief hardens. Not because evidence accumulates, but because counter-evidence disappears. And once belief hardens, it resists correction fiercely. Which brings us to the next stage of the story. Because as the algorithmic momentum built, something curious happened. People started asking for proof. Not skeptics, believers. They wanted something tangible, something official, something they could point to and say, see? The narrative had reached a point where imagery and authority weren't enough. It needed grounding, validation, a sense that somewhere, outside the internet, reality itself had acknowledged the claim. And that pressure produced a new shift, one that attempted to anchor the story in the physical world. That's where we're going next. Because the moment people start demanding verification, stories like this don't collapse. They adapt. And the adaptation that followed is perhaps the most revealing part of all. There's a moment in every runaway story when belief runs ahead of itself. When even the people who are fully on board begin to feel an itch. Not doubt exactly. More like impatience. A desire for something solid. Something they can point to. Something that exists outside the churn of videos and posts and arguments. That moment arrived quietly. Not with skeptics. With believers. You could see it in the comments if you knew what to look for. Short phrases. Repeated questions. Not hostile. Almost hopeful. Is there a document? Where can I find the record? Has this been filed anywhere official? Those questions mattered. Because they signaled a shift. The narrative had done its emotional work. Authority had been invoked. Imagery had taken over. Algorithms had amplified the most disturbing versions. But now the story needed something else. It needed grounding. Something verifiable. And that's where reality entered the frame. Not as a rebuttal, but as an inconvenient presence. Because when you move from implication to verification, the rules change. Suddenly, there are systems, processes, paper trails, institutions that don't care about virality or outrage. Institutions that exist precisely to record mundane facts in unglamorous ways. Births, registrations, legal acknowledgments, boring things, which is exactly why they matter. Let's slow down and be very careful here. Examining verifiable records is not the same as declaring anything resolved. It's not about defending or accusing. It's about understanding what can be checked and what can't. And that distinction is where this story begins to strain. In the UK, births are recorded through formal civil registration systems. Names, dates, locations, parentage. These records are handled by bureaucratic bodies whose entire purpose is to be dull, consistent, and resistant to drama. They are not intelligence agencies. They are not media outlets. They do not operate in secrecy. They operate in routine. That routine is the point. When people began asking for proof, some were directed toward institutions like the General Register Office. Others pointed to public announcements, archival reporting, legal acknowledgments tied to titles, and succession rules. Not because these things are exciting, but because they are part of the infrastructure of reality. And here's what's important. Nothing in those systems reflected the extraordinary claims being made online. No anomalies. No flagged discrepancies. No procedural irregularities that would even hint at the kind of intervention being alleged. That doesn't prove anything by itself. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, a phrase that gets misused, but not incorrectly. But it does reintroduce friction, because the claim wasn't modest. It was maximal. It wasn't suggesting uncertainty or ambiguity. It was suggesting exposure, revelation, institutional acknowledgement. Claims of that magnitude don't coexist quietly with bureaucratic normalcy. They collide. If there had been any formal recognition of wrongdoing at the level being implied, it would not sit neatly alongside unremarkable records. It would create disruption, legal consequences, challenges, amendments, something. Instead, the systems that deal with facts behaved as they always do. Indifferently. This is where some believers pivoted to a familiar argument. These records can be falsified. The system would cover it up. They control the paperwork. It's an understandable instinct. When a claim runs into contradiction, the contradiction gets absorbed into the narrative. But notice what that move requires. It requires believing not just in one hidden action, but in a vast, perfectly coordinated effort across multiple institutions. Civil servants, registrars, legal professionals, archivists, all acting in silent unison, without leaks, without errors, without dissent. That's not skepticism. That's an expansion of the claim. And expansions like that don't strengthen stories. They make them brittle. Because the larger a conspiracy becomes, the more points of failure it introduces. The more people would have to be involved. The more opportunities for something, anything, to surface. Real cover-ups are small, fragile, messy. They leak precisely because humans are bad at sustained secrecy. This story required the opposite. Perfect silence. Perfect coordination. Perfect obedience. That's not how systems behave. Here's something else that's worth sitting with. The institutions responsible for record-keeping do not answer to intelligence agencies in the way people imagine. Their mandates are separate. Their incentives are different. Their accountability structures are not interchangeable. Conflating them requires a flattening of reality. Everything becomes they. They control it. They hide it. They won't let you see. Once that happens, specificity evaporates. The story stops being about actual mechanisms and becomes about an abstract force. And abstract forces are impossible to verify. But let's go further. When believers asked for proof, what they often received in response wasn't documentation, it was reassurance. Statements like, "The truth will come out," or "It's bigger than paperwork," or "You'll see soon." Those are not evidentiary answers. They're narrative placeholders. They keep people invested while postponing accountability. In legitimate investigations, demands for proof produce tension. They force clarification. They sharpen claims. They either move the story forward or collapse it. Here, demands for proof were treated as impatience. As if asking for verification meant you didn't understand the stakes. That's another inversion. High-stakes claims require higher standards, not lower ones. But lowering the standard was necessary to keep the story intact. Because once you apply even basic verification, not conclusions, just checks, the story stops behaving like an exposé and starts behaving like a rumor that's grown too large to control. This is where some creators change tactics. Instead of pointing to records, they attacked the idea of records. They framed bureaucracy itself as untrustworthy. As part of the same shadowy system, they claimed intelligence agencies represented. Everything became suspect. Documents were lies. Registrations were fabrications. Silence was confirmation. At that point, the story had achieved total insulation. No evidence could disprove it, because all evidence was assumed corrupt. That's not investigation. That's belief. And belief, once structured this way, doesn't interact with reality. It replaces it. There's another element here that rarely gets discussed. In the UK, matters involving titles, succession, and formal recognition are not handled casually. They intersect with constitutional norms, parliamentary awareness, and legal precedent. They create paper trails that extend beyond any single office. If there were serious irregularities of the kind being implied, they wouldn't just be hidden. They would be contested. Quietly, perhaps. Procedurally. But contested. Yet no such contestation surfaced. No legal challenges. No parliamentary questions in bodies like the UK Parliament that would suggest institutional alarm. No procedural disputes leaking into public view. Again, this doesn't prove innocence or guilt. What it does is reintroduce scale. The claim is enormous. The footprint is non-existent. That mismatch matters. Because extraordinary claims don't exist in a vacuum. They distort the systems around them. This one didn't. Which is why, at this stage, something subtle began to happen. Some believers didn't abandon the story. They adjusted their expectations. They stopped looking for proof in the present and started pushing it into the future. Wait. Be patient. It will all come out. That move keeps belief alive while avoiding confrontation with the present. But it also changes the story's function. It stops being about discovery and starts being about anticipation. And anticipation is emotionally potent. It keeps people engaged. It keeps channels alive. It keeps comment sections active, but it also postpones reckoning indefinitely, because as long as the proof is always coming later, it never has to arrive now. This is where we need to pause and reflect. What we're seeing here is not just a failure of verification. It's a shift away from verification entirely. The story no longer seeks confirmation.